We're talking today about Jacksonian democracy. We've talked in the past about how Thomas Jefferson brought about an element of casual into the White House by wearing his slippers and his favorite old tattered vest to meetings, and how he invited people to official state dinners by handing them notes that he scrawled instead of using the official White House calligrapher and that sort of thing. But Andrew Jackson's presidency brought a different element even still to the White House. And this could easily be seen on his inauguration day when crowds of rowdy attendees destroyed many of the White House furnishings during their massive partying. So here's what's leading up to Jackson's presidency and the development of a new political party. Even though our nation was founded as a republic, more people began to embrace the idea of majority rule. As some states began to loosen their property ownership requirements for voting rights, more people started to consider that just maybe they should also have that right to vote. This caused a new breed of politician to develop, one that catered less to the elite and more to the masses. And realizing that there's more general public than elite public, these people began searching for their representation in politics. Andrew Jackson was a guy like them. He wanted American expansion, and he was known as a fighter. He was an average guy of no special educational background and no family heritage, and it was through his own gumption that he made a name for himself in the War of 1812. So, he was in the right place at the right time politically. Until this point, the U.S. pretty much operated around something called the Code of Deference. That's the practice of showing respect to a person because of their distinguishing characteristics through maybe military accomplishments, perhaps their educational level, their business success, or family pedigree. Jackson could have fallen into this category because of his military experience, but he certainly had none of the other qualities. The first party system in the United States shaped the political contest between the Federalist and the Democratic Republicans. The Federalist, led by Washington, Hamilton, and Adams, dominated American politics into the 1790s. With the election, though, of Thomas Jefferson, the Democratic Republicans took power. After 1816, when the Democratic Republican James Monroe beat Federalist Rufus King, the Federalist Party died at the national level. Until the 1820s, the Code of Deference was firmly in place, but when the Federalists lost power, the idea of rule by the elite that required all voters to be landowners began to lose its hold, and it opened up to universal manhood suffrage. Now, that was the right of all white males to vote, regardless of their social or economic status. So now the United States has opened up voting to more people than ever. Slavery is still a part of life at this point, but there are some free blacks who own land. They were excluded from voting, as were women. And of course, Native Americans were not seen as citizens at all, so they didn't have the right to vote at this time either. The 1824 election is important for a couple of reasons. First, it's the first time in history that all legal voters were allowed to vote for president. Until then, a congressional caucus was held to determine the elections. There were 4 candidates for president. Ultimately, we started with 5, but they were all Democratic Republicans. There was William Crawford of Georgia. He was the Secretary of Treasury and a states' right advocate. Then there was John Quincy Adams, who was the son of the second president and Secretary of State. John C. Calhoun, who was a strong proponent of internal improvements. And Henry Clay, who was the current Speaker of the House. He dropped out to be a candidate for vice president. And then Andrew Jackson, who was nominated by people in his state. And I'd like to point out here, too, that at this particular time, being Secretary of State seemed like a natural stepping stone to the office of president. So that's going to be important as this election controversy continues. The second reason the election of 1824 is important is because of the controversy that stemmed from it. In the field of 4, remember Henry Clay dropped out so he could be vice president. In the field of 4, votes were split. Andrew Jackson clearly won the popular vote and the most votes in the Electoral College, But it's not just enough to win the most votes in the Electoral College. He didn't win the number of votes needed to win the office. So without a definitive decision in the Electoral College, the election then would be decided by the House of Representatives. And Henry Clay, remember he's the one who dropped out of the presidential campaign so that he could be considered a candidate for vice president. Henry Clay is the one who cast the deciding vote in that election, and he voted for John Quincy Adams. In return, Adams made Clay the Secretary of State, which, as I mentioned previously, was clearly a stepping stone to the office of president. This was seen as a corrupt bargain, and Jackson supporters vowed revenge at that point. So John Quincy Adams took office with Southerner John C. Calhoun as his vice president and Henry Clay as his Secretary of State. Clay's American system included high tariffs, a national bank, and federally funded improvements for canals and roads. Adams adopted the American system and added a national university and naval academy to train future leaders. A lot of people saw this move as an elitist move instead of something that could benefit everyone. It wasn't a public college as such, but it was a national university and naval academy to train future military leaders. So seeing these as elitist moves further united the larger general public against Adams, and they were bonding together for Jackson. Adams wanted to promote manufacturing in New England, so he proposed high tariffs on imports, up to 50% of the product's value. This is known as the Tariff of Abominations, which created strife between the North and the South, since the South was largely agricultural and had to import more manufactured goods than the North. So the tariff really hurt the South. The Tariff of Abominations made Southerners question the North's intentions. They also feared that slavery might come under attack by the North, especially the northern majority in Congress. And as we all know, the economy of the South centered around slavery. As a Southerner, Vice President John C. Calhoun was even angry about this tariff. So when the election of 1828 rolled around, it pitted Adams against Jackson, the elite versus the rugged pioneer. It was against Adams who can write and Jackson who can fight. Jackson didn't even campaign. His supporters did the work for him. They held rallies, they planned parades, they started Hickory clubs because his nickname from the War of 1812 was Old Hickory. And again, Jackson did not campaign. This grassroots campaign did it for him. And in November 1828, when voters went to the polls, Jackson won 56% of the popular vote and 68% of the electoral vote, which was a clear win and the very first win for the Democratic Party. Ironically, Federalist John Adams, who was John Quincy's dad, was beaten by Thomas Jefferson's new party, the Democratic Republicans, in 1800. So that takes us into the Jackson presidency. Discovering fraud and scandal, Jackson fired about half of the civil officers in the government, and then he picked their replacements. Now, this is called rotation in office. Opponents of Jackson argued that this was the spoils system at work, that it was the winner awarding his supporters with federal jobs, and they weren't exactly wrong. Some of Jackson's appointees clearly weren't qualified for the jobs, and they clearly got the jobs simply because they supported him and got him elected. And some of them were not the best choice for the job for other reasons. One in New York stole over $1 million, and it showed that he discredited merit, education, and responsibility in his decisions to the opposing party. So this is something they're going to try to use against him when he runs for re-election. So what is a presidency without scandal, right? Well, Jackson saw his share of scandal. One of those scandals during his term in office was the Petticoat Affair. Now, Now, this had nothing to do with an affair between Jackson and someone. Jackson was actually widowed. His wife passed away. So his niece was serving the duties as First Lady. So she would host things at the White House as needed. But it was Senator John Eaton of Tennessee who took a woman named Peggy to state dinners and White House events where it would be appropriate for a man to bring a date. But Peggy was Peggy O'Neill. She was actually married to Naval Officer John Timberlake, and the couple had 3 kids. So the women of the D.C. elite, including Jackson's niece, shunned Peggy O'Neill. But Jackson took up for her, and that's how he got involved in the petticoat affair. He took up for her because his own wife was seen as scandalous because she'd been married and divorced before she married Jackson. So he knew how hard it was for women when they were shunned by other women, kind of catfight. Ow. Anyway, Peggy's husband committed suicide. Naturally, rumors abound about, it was because of this affair he found out or something like that. She married Eaton quickly at that point, which also created more rumors. But Martin Van Buren defended the Eatons, and he invited them to gatherings and developed kind of a social circle in which they could all be in together and be comfortable. And this kind of informal group of advisors was referred to as the kitchen cabinet. Not the president's official cabinet, but the kitchen cabinet. And, if you've, kitchen guests are best, you've heard that saying before. Those are the people who sit around the table and just talk. So this was a group of friends that came out of this petticoat affair. There was another scandal at the time that involved a tiff between Jackson and the state of South Carolina. So this was over the tariff of 1828, the abomination tariff that we've talked about. The tariff showed the strength of the federal government, which really worried the South because, again, they were concerned that they might flex the federal muscle to stop slavery. So South Carolina begins nullification, which is their process of voiding unwelcome federal laws. So, if the state doesn't like that, nullify it, Anyway, so South Carolina supported nullification, and some other southern states worried, though, that it would push them into a situation where they had to secede from the Union, possibly forced out by the Union. So they didn't want to do that. South Carolina was the only one who embraced this idea of nullification. Now, as far as the tariff of 1828, the abomination tariff, Jackson didn't like it, but he didn't make a complete repeal of that tariff as a high priority. Instead, he asked for a reduction of rates. Still, the people in South Carolina just didn't think that was enough. So South Carolina doubled down on their nullification, and Jackson continued to uphold the tariff. South Carolina Governor Hayne called 10,000 volunteers to protect the state from federal action. He was afraid that there would be military action because of his stance. So Jackson asked the federal government for the Force Bill of 1833, which gave the federal government the right to use troops to ensure compliance with federal law. So now they're at a standoff. The South Carolina crisis ended with the Compromise Tariff of 1833, which reduced the tariffs tremendously to a point that South Carolina could live with it. But now, just to prove a point, South Carolina's legislature met and nullified the Force Bill. So they're still practicing nullification, even though they see that the feds can bring in troops and enforce with military action. But this was just one last dig to prove a point. The importance of this whole thing, though, is that it shows growing tensions between the North and South and between the elite and the public majority. Also, it's showing additional tension building in this whole abolition versus slavery issue. And Jackson's presidency also had to contend with the bank war. Jackson, in his presidency, also had to deal with the bank war. Now, he disagreed with the congressional majority over the need for a national bank. You may recall that the charter for the Bank of the U.S. was established by Hamilton in 1791 and expired in 1811. And there was a large deal of public mistrust for the bank, and so Congress did not renew it. But then in 1816, Congress takes up the idea again and creates the second Bank of the U.S. I guess the idea was, Oh, they didn't trust the first bank, but they'll trust the second one. Anyway, so the Second Bank of the U.S. was started in 1816 and set to expire in 1836. And in 1816, there were 200 banks across the country, and they all issued their own paper money. There was no standard backing it, though. It's not like it was based on the gold or silver standard. It was literally just printed paper. So in Jackson's administration, he personally disliked the bank's director, additionally to, not liking the bank system at all. He just disliked the bank's director and saw the bank as a tool for the wealthy. Henry Clay and other congressmen tried to push through the recharter of the bank in 1832. Now, that's 4 years before it's set to expire, but they have the majority in Congress. So they're looking at going ahead and pushing this through to recharter it again. Congress approved the recharter, Jackson vetoed it and dismantled the bank. And then in 1835, Jackson was the first president to pay off the entire national debt. Now, while that's great, people were still mad about the dismantling of the national bank. So a new political party forms out of that. They're called the Whigs. Now, we had Whigs before, right? Well, so this is a revival of the Whigs. They chose the name for the Whigs that fought the monarchy from the power of England in the 1700s. So they are equating Jackson to a monarch. So for a little more about the Whigs revisited, they were for active federal government at the federal level, not so much into the state level. They were definitely for a national bank. And there were several Whig candidates that ran against Jackson's handpicked successor, Martin Van Buren. And because they had so many candidates, the vote split, leaving a clear win for Van Buren, the Democrat. So we're jumping back a little bit now. I just mentioned Van Buren's election, but we're back now during Jackson's presidency with the Indian Removal Act. This deserves more coverage than we're giving it here, so please do watch the video links that I'm providing in the lecture notes section. But here we'll just cover that there were 5 civilized tribes: the Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole, and Cherokee, and they were called civilized because they were the ones who assimilated most, and some of them even had slaves. And there's an important case here too that you'll need to know in Worcester versus Georgia, where the Supreme Court ironically established the principle of tribal sovereignty, but failed to halt the Indian Removal Act, which led, of course, to what we know as the forced Native American migration called the Trail of Tears. So now we're at the end of Jackson's second term, and he's ready to retire. The 2-term presidential limit didn't start until 1951, so he could have run again, but he was tired. He handpicked Martin Van Buren to be his successor, and as I've already mentioned, he won. So in this 2-party system, voter turnout increased. You have an either-or situation. You have this one or that one. You know that one of these 2 candidates is going to be elected. So it made the fight seem more fair. It also made it seem more vital. The Whigs were into federal involvement to accelerate growth economically. They were wealthier, and they were Southern planters and urban Northerners. The Democrats saw a smaller role of national government, and they saw that more power should stay within the states, and they considered themselves the defenders of the common people against the elite. So I want to point out to you, as we start looking at political parties and trying to analyze how we get to where we are today, the role of the Democrats at this point in 1840, the fact that they believed in a smaller role of national government, and that more power should stay within the states. Today, that's something we totally associate with the Republican Party. However, kind of a larger role of federal government. So this is still developing. We still haven't gotten to Democrats and Republicans just yet. But you can see some of the principles developing that will blend together and form the parties that we know later on. So in the election of 1840, these 2 candidates who ran, were Martin Van Buren, the incumbent, who won the election of 1836, and William Henry Harrison, the Whig. As the incumbent, Martin Van Buren felt, he had a good shot at winning. The Democratic Party felt like he did as well, or they wouldn't have put him in the position to run. But at this point, we see something different developing in the campaign for office. We have the Democrats who were saying, oh, well, Harrison is so old at age 67, he shouldn't be president. He'd be better off drinking hard liquor or drinking hard cider, which is really liquor, and sitting in his cabin. So what was meant to be a slam was spun by the Whigs, and they started serving liquor at all of their political rallies, and they held a lot of them. And so that's where the liquor was provided by the EC Booze Company, which is totally where we get the word booze today. And the Whigs won the election. So that brings us to the end of this chapter about Jacksonian democracy and the idea of majority rule and the development of our two-party system. If you have any questions or comments, just let me know.